Hi everyone. In this video, I want to talk about the absolute value, and more specifically, I want to talk about absolute value equations. Okay, so we can think of the absolute value of a number as the distance from 0 on the number line for that number. Okay, so let's say we want to look at the number 3. We want to find the absolute value of 3. Okay, so let's find 3 here on the number line, and we count its distance from 0. So this one's pretty easy, it's obvious. 1, 2, 3. So we say its distance is 3. Okay, but let's say we wanted to find the absolute value of negative 3. So we find negative 3 here, and what we would do is we would count from 0 how far negative 3 is. So it is 3 units away from 0. So we would say the absolute value of negative 3 is 3. So one interesting feature from the absolute value is that you're always going to get a positive answer, because you always have to have, or I guess it could be 0 or a positive answer. If you have 0 in here, then it would be 0. But if it's not 0, it's going to be a positive answer, because you can't really have a negative distance, as that doesn't really make sense. So in some ways, you can think of the absolute value as a distance operator. It's the thing that determines how far away from 0 something is. Okay, so with that, let's look at a few equations here. All right, so in practice, what this means is that we need to see if we can figure out what values would make sense on the inside of the absolute value sign, okay? So let's look here at this one. Here we have the absolute value of 6x is equal to 12. So in practice, what we're doing here is we're saying we need to find 6x is equal to 12, or 6x is equal to negative 12, okay? And we'll show what I mean by that here in a minute once we've solved each of these. So if we solve for each of these, if we plug in if we solve for 6x equals 12, we can divide both sides by 6. The 6's here will cancel, and we'll end up with x is equal to 2. Okay, because 12 divided by 6 is 2. Or over here, if we divide both sides by 6, we'll end up with x is equal to negative 2. So what happens here is if we plug in either of these, if we plug in x is equal to 2, right? So if we have the absolute value of 6 times negative 2, that gives us the absolute value of negative 12. And the distance negative 12 is from 0 is just 12. So that would work here. And if we plugged in positive 2, we would get the absolute value of 12, which is just 12. So both 2 and negative 2 would make sense here. So we need to consider both the positive and the negative of what the absolute value is equal to. All right, so let's look at this one. Here we have 3x, the absolute value of 3x minus 6. So here we need to consider 3x minus 6 is equal to 3, or 3x minus 6 is equal to negative 3. Okay, so we can add 6 to both sides here. Let me move this down. If we add 6 to both sides, we'll have 3x is equal to 9. We can divide both sides by 3 to isolate x, and we end up with, I didn't space these out very well. Sorry about that. If we divide both sides by 3, we'll end up with x is equal to 3. Then over here, if we add 6 to both sides, 6's will cancel, and we end up with 3x is equal to 3. And then we can divide both sides by 3, and we get x is equal to 1. So let's check each of these to make sure that they both make sense. So let's try x equals 3 first. Here we have 3 times 3 minus 6. Okay, the absolute value of 3 times 3 minus 6, that's the same thing as the absolute value of 9 minus 6, which is the same thing as the absolute value of 3, which is 3. So that works. Okay, now let's try 1. So if we have 3 times 1 minus 6, we get just 3 minus 6, which is the absolute value of -3, which just gives us 3 as well. So that also makes sense. So both x equals 3 and x equals 1 will work here. Let's look at another one here. Here we have an interesting example. Here we have the absolute value of 3v plus 24 is equal to 0. So in this case, our first reaction is to consider both the positive and the negative, but we don't really have a positive and negative 0. So we actually, in this case, can just ignore the absolute value sign here, okay? So we can treat this as 3v plus 24 is equal to 0. I suppose you could write it out as positive or negative 0, but that doesn't really make sense, so we'll just consider the 1. But then we would solve for v by taking 24 away from both sides, and we'll get 3v is equal to -24. If we divide both sides of the equation by 3, we'll get v is equal to -8. Okay, and let's check to make sure that that works. So here we have the absolute value of 3 times -8 plus 24. And that's equal, it should be equal to 0 if we did this right. But we have the absolute value of -24 plus 24, which is equal to the absolute value of 0, and the distance 0 is from 0 is just 0. So our final answer here would be v equals -8. Okay, now let's look at this one. Here we have 4 times the absolute value of 5v is equal to 80. So anytime you have an equation involving absolute values, you want to try and isolate that absolute value by itself before you set it up for both the positive and the negative that you're trying to consider, okay? So let's see if we can isolate that first. So to do that, we're going to divide both sides of the equation by 4. If I can write today. Divide both sides of the equation by 4. And we're going to end up with the absolute value of 5v is equal to 80 divided by 4, which is 20. Okay, and now we consider 5v is equal to 20, or 5v is equal to -20. Okay, so if we solve this first one here, if we divide both sides by 5, we will end up with v is equal to 20 divided by 5, or 4. We also have, over here, we can divide both sides by 5. And we'll end up with v is equal to -4. So let's see that both of these make sense. So here we initially started with 4 times the absolute value of 5v. So we'll do 4 times the absolute value of 5 times 4. And that's going to give us 4 times the absolute value of 20, which is just 4 times 20. And that's going to give us 80. So that one works. Let's check the other one. If we check the other one, we'll have 4 times the absolute value of 5 times -4. Okay, and that's equal to 4 times the absolute value of -20. And the absolute value of -20 is just positive 20. So we have 4 times 20 again, which is just 80. So both of these will work. Okay, so now let's look at kind of an interesting little quirk here with absolute value equations. So here we have the absolute value of 2w minus 2 absolute value of 2w space minus 2. So we're just considering the absolute value of 2w here. Minus 2 equals -18. Okay, so like we did in the previous one, we want to see if we can isolate the absolute value by itself. So let's add 2 to both sides. And we end up with the absolute value of 2w is equal to -16. Okay, well, we have sort of a problem here because we have an absolute value by itself, with whatever we have on the inside, it doesn't really matter, being equal to a negative number. The problem here is that's never going to make sense. So once you've isolated an absolute value all by itself, if you have a negative number on the other side of the equation, that means that you are not going to have a solution here. So here we would say we have no solution. And this is just because you can't have a negative distance. Since the absolute value looks at the distance on the number line, you're never going to have a distance of negative 16. There's no value of w that's going to allow you to have a distance of negative 16. So we would just say there is no solution.